Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and I have a 7 tips guide for the Warden class in the Lord of the Rings Online. For anyone unfamiliar, this will be loosely based off my 7 tips text guide on LOTRO basics, but this is really a standalone video and it's just some exciting tips I personally have to share with the Warden class to hopefully improve your experience on the Warden. As usual, any feedback is appreciated, but let's get going. And to start off, I want to list the 7 tips, and I will include timestamps so you can skip to what is most interesting to you. For tip number 1, that will be on prioritizing Gambit mastery builders. Tip 2 is about using your strongest Gambits first, and tip 3, I will share some good Gambits for battle memory and cover the potency mechanic. And tip 4, I will point out some often overlooked or often overlooked but really strong skill to use in rotation. And tip 5, I remind everyone about some strong non-Gambit skills to use. And tip 6, I will switch gears and we will talk about some stats with gear. And finally, the last tip actually covers what I think is the best way to get better on your Warden. So starting off with tip number 1, that is on prioritizing Gambit mastery builders, and I do want to say that I'm going to assume you in general know how the Gambit builders work, and just very quickly, Spear is 1, 2 is Shield, 3 is Fist, but your Gambit mastery builders build 2 of these at once, and they're also immediate. So if I actually get in combat here, I'm at a training dummy in Galtrab for most of this. I will be moving around a little bit. But your Gambit mastery builders, if I just click them here, they're all immediate and go off super fast. So you want to prioritize these in building your Gambits. And again, they do 2 combinations of your Gambit builders. They do all the combinations possible. There are 9 mastery builders, and you get these at level 20, so it's going to be a little bit in your Warden experience until you get these. But once you get them, that's when I really think you should start practicing with them, because they are going to be very useful. They will probably seem confusing at first. There are so many. I'm just putting them up here to show you all it kind of got crazy there. But I'll go ahead and exit out all of that, and we can just look at them as I have them. So you have like Spear and Shield, Shield and Spear, and etc., all those sort of things. But they're really good at just quickly building some Gambits. So Unnerving Strike is the strongest bleed that we use on a Warden, so if I use my Gambit mastery builders, it's going to be extremely quick to build. So if I just used it with the regular builders, 1 2 3 1 2, it's kind of slow to get that built up. But if I use my Gambit masteries, it's super quick. Even though I personally click them, it'd actually be quicker if I use my keybind. So if I use like I would actually have to get it right. So if I wanted to build like Desolation quickly, I could use the Gambit mastery builders in combination with my available regular builders 1 2 and 3, and the Gambit mastery builders are just a lot quicker and weaving in. Like I just used Surety of Death, but when I used 2 of the Gambit mastery builders, it was a lot quicker. And then one thing I did want to point out is you've probably seen me using like Spear, Spear, Shield, Shield, and Fist, Fist, even when I only need 1 builder. So something like Surety of Death, it's very quick to build using 3, and then the Mastery with 2 3 and 2 2. Even though you waste the second builder from using something like Shield Shield, Fist Fist, and Spear Spear, or even in some cases you might be building Unerring Strike, again that's the strongest bleed, and you might have the only Mastery builder available as Shield and Spear. It's actually worth using that just to build it quicker. Whereas if I was building the last builder of Unerring Strike, I could press 2, but that's just a little bit slower compared to using 2 2 there and having that built quickly with the mastery builder. So I did just want to point that out, and that is another thing, another complexity with the Gambit mastery builders, besides really recognizing what they all are and all the combinations. And it does take a little bit to get used to, because there are a lot of Gambits you want to use a lot of combinations depending what you're doing. So I'll just attack this target dummy a little bit and like go over some of the things I might do. I actually did 2-1 there and then did the mastery builder. That would actually be suboptimal, but yeah, this is just to show you all again a little bit how these can be utilized in combat as you're building your Gambits and just going about your gameplay. I regularly use them in any sort of Gambit I build. I definitely prioritize. If I'm even doing Brink of Victory there, I would go about using 3 3 to cap it off, and then Surety of Death, I'm doing that. And a lot of them are on cooldown because, well, we want them to be on cooldown. That means we're actually properly using them. And again, it will probably take quite a bit for you all to get used to if you're just starting out with your Warden, just getting level 20 and like suddenly getting all these. But I think it's very important, and that's why I'm spending quite a bit of time on it, but I think we can go ahead and move on to the second tip. For tip number 2, I want to talk about using your strongest gambits first, and I have 2 different gambit lines up here on the screen. On the right is the Fist Spear, the 3-1 line, and then on the left is going to be the bleed chain, which is 1 2 3, then 1 2 3 1, and so forth. And with this, the spear chain, importantly, if you use the gambits in order like 1 2 3, then 1 2 3 1, power attack, then mighty blow, then unerring strike, you get a bonus. In the bonus part here, the icons for these, the tooltips rather, are quite confusing and complex with these bleeds, so I do just want to point out the bonus is in this yellow text down here. It says deals bonus damage if target has been recently struck with power attack, 2038 common damage. The 15% chance to apply, that is not a part of the bonus damage. That is just something separate from being spec'd into the red line as a warden at this point. But unerring strike has the same thing. It deals bonus damage if the target has been recently struck with mighty blow. But what you might be able to see is the damage, the bonus damage it deals is very tiny and not really worth it to actually use power attack, then mighty blow, then unerring strike, when you can get a lot more damage from using unerring strike first. If we look at the actual bleed damage, unerring strike itself does 2000 more than mighty blow, but mighty blow does over twice as much damage as power attack, and it's just a lot stronger to go ahead and use the strong gambit first there. Even though it does have that chain, it's kind of pushed towards the idea of you use power attack, then mighty blow, then unerring strike for the chain, but it is not worth doing that. And just to look at another example, I have the 3-1 line up here on the right again, and this one has no chain effect. It's just, this is what these skills do, and you can just build them whenever. You don't have to go precise blow, piercing strike, spear, virtue, and you actually don't even get any benefit from that. But the main thing with these is the damage over time component. This is also just an example of using the strongest gambit first. Spear or virtue does more damage over time than piercing strike, and piercing strike does more damage over time than precise blow. And the main draw of these gambits is it's our light damage over time line. Again, our bleed line over here, the main component of that is the damage over time bleed. So these are just 2 I wanted to point out, but there is actually one other gambit line and chain that I want to look at to show you all and talk about a little bit more complex scenario. So here we're actually going to be looking at 2 gambit lines. First off, there is the defensive buff line on the right and the healing line on the left. Alright, so I just added the finishing blow icons up here, the tooltips rather, again. But what I want to do is go over the healing line and then the defensive buff line, and how these are just a little bit more complex and less straightforward than using strongest gambits first. The strongest gambits first, as like a general rule, is mainly with dealing damage and the DPS stuff, but when you're boosting your defenses, you actually do have to consider if you want to use them in a chain, and there are actually scenarios where you can get use the strongest gambit first and then do something to get the chain effect as well, which we will be covering in the 7 tips. But anyway, to start off, using persevere, then safeguard, and then either finishing on celebration of skill or restoration, you'll get a bonus use if you use persevere, then safeguard. So after using persevere and safeguard, you will get this finishing blow buff, and that will actually make both these gambits, celebration of skill and restoration, get this bonus effect. So not only will you get a partial block chance, percent block rating, and incoming healing as a defensive boost, that's the type of stuff that celebration of skill already gives, but you will also get increased healing with your restoration skill when you use that. So for the purpose of this video, I'm mainly going to look at the healing, so I'm actually going to close out celebration of skill here, because we are interested in the healing you get on that. So of course, if you use restoration right away, you get more healing, and the difference would be more noticeable in the blue line. I probably should have switched for this, but the idea is that using the strongest gambit gives you more healing, and that's really what you want out of it. But if you use persevere then safeguard, you can actually get even more healing out of restoration. But the important thing is, if we look at the numbers, restoration gives 500 morale, so if that restores 25% more, you get 125 morale more out of that, so it'd be around 625 morale if you use the bonus. And that's a little bit of a boost, but it's not too much overall. If we use Persevere and then Safeguard and then Restoration, we would get more morale overall, but if we immediately need some health, then this is really something I should have switched to the blue line for, so I'm actually going to do that right now. The icons at the top won't update, but I do want to point out, pretty high in the blue line if you get the updated Restoration, which is on the right. This is the blue line Restoration. I'll keep it a little bit separate and up here just to make that very clear. This one you actually get some more morale initially, so you get another boost just for using Restoration, and that 25% will help with that, but there's just more impact on using your strongest Gambit first in the blue line with the healing line. But I do want to point out, because you get more healing overall, it can be good to go in the order for Persevere, Safeguard, and then using Restoration to get the maximum healing. So it's not as straightforward with that. And one thing we'll cover in the next tip is actually using Potency in the battle memory system. One thing you can do is use Restoration, put that in battle memory essentially, and I'll go ahead and actually do that here. It's a little bit hard to see with all the icons on the screen, but if I do Restoration here, and then get it in battle memory, I could go about using Persevere, then Safeguard very slowly here, and then I'll actually get the bonus healing out of Restoration. And that's just the way that works, and the kind of situation I would actually recommend it. But again, we'll cover more with Potency in the next tip. Actually a little bit weird that I have to cover that now, but that's okay. And the other line I wanted to look at, I'll leave that up just for reference, but the other line I want to look at is on the right of the screen here, and it's Oppressive Flourish, Maddening Strike, which similarly to Persevere and Safeguard, this will give you a buff, which is the Finishing Blow Impressive Flourish buff up here for Dance of War and Conviction. So what this buff gives is increased crit defense. It's a raw rating of crit defense, and it also gives increased mitigation rating, and it's a raw mitigation rating increase. And this is actually a situation I want to point out, that the Finishing Blow for the Impressive Flourish line is basically useless, unfortunately. The magnitude of the critical defense buff is very low, especially compared to what we get from the actual Gambits. The finishing skill mitigations rating 161 is basically nothing, again, with my numbers comparing it to the actual mitigation these give, so that's nothing. And Conviction doesn't really heal for much, even in the blue line. I switched to the blue line here so we can just look at it. Conviction doesn't really heal much, and getting 20% increase on that, even up to the 289 morale versus 266 morale, and even considering the overtime how much longer the blue line Conviction lasts, it's just not worth it. So this is an example of one that also seems like you want to go through the chain and get these nice defensive boosts, but it's not worth it, and that is the point of this tip. But I think that covers everything I want to highlight. Again, mainly with the healing line, it's just a little bit different, and that's sort of a bonus tip, if you will. So for tip number 3, I want to cover some good gambits for battle memory, and just to give a little background of Potency first, is you have to use these gambits, Death Strike, Defensive Strike, and Goad, and then using the gambit after you use one of these will put the gambit you use into battle memory. And an important thing just to note with battle memory is the cost of the gambit in that will actually cost morale, and a percent of morale equal to the number of icons used to build the gambit. So like a 5 gambit like Unerring Strike in that would cost 5% of your morale, so that is something to consider with that. But I'm going to go ahead and just move these to the left of the screen to keep as reference for you all as we go about the gameplay here, and you can look at those if you like, but otherwise I want to actually show this stuff in action. So again, Death Strike, Defensive Strike, Goad, they're 1-1, 2-2, and 3-3. So if I just use Death Strike and then put Unerring Strike, a bleed I keep talking about, our strongest bleed, I use that, and then Unerring Strike will be in battle memory. So now I can just freely use it. I could use it on another enemy. That's actually one good thing, and this is a good gambit to use with battle memory. Good thing to start off with that. So kind of one strategy with that is you can use Unerring Strike in battle memory, and you can use it on another target if you like, or you can save it. You can go about the rest of your gameplay and just save it for when that bleed effect goes off. And another thing is, as we already talked about, the healing gambit can be good. If you get restoration, then you can go about your heal chain. I already showed this a little bit, but use persevere and then you can use safeguard and you got the immediate healing effect. And even with this costing 5% of the morale, over time it will restore more morale, even though initially it does cost 5% morale. In the battle memory, if we actually looked at that, it did restore more morale than it costed. So I did want to cover that, but one thing I kind of forgot to do is in general, it's better to use your gambits that have a lot of icons to them. So like your 5 gambits, your 4 gambit builder gambits, those are all good ones for battle memory because they take the longest to build, and having them available for immediate use is going to be good. So Unerring Strike is a good one for that. Even Dark Before Dawn, that's not one I really talk about much, but this one restores power. If you really need a power restore, that can be good to use and then put in battle memory to gain the increased effect with the immediate power and even the power over time restore of that. There's also something for AoE, something like Desolation, or even Surety of Death wouldn't be too bad if you can't cast Desolation on it. And just to actually point out, for the actual potency gambits, if we look at those again on the left, the one we get the most effect out of in every line is going to be Goad, but importantly, Goad is an AoE and it's a light dot. I would say Defensive Strike gives a tiny buff, but the defensive buff from that is basically negligible. I think even in the blue line, this actually is the blue line, the version you see, so it's definitely negligible. We can look at all this stuff in the red line just to be sure nothing is missed. And Def Strike, it just does basic damage. I'll go about the gameplay a little bit while we go through these, just so I can show you all a little bit about the battle memory. And then Goad, actually I totally missed what Goad did, but the point is that Goad is going to be our strongest one, and when you can use Goad, it will be the best one to use to get your next skill in battle memory. So again, Unerring Strike is a good option, and could use Surety of Death here if I had it in that, but that's just the way that kind of works. One other thing I wanted to point out, this will actually be the next tip, but another good gambit for this is Ranged Resounding Challenge, because you have to go into the range stance. Even as a melee warden, this is a strong gambit. You have to go into the melee stance, into the range stance to use it. So putting it in battle memory, so if I use Goad and actually put it in battle memory here, I can use Ranged Resounding Challenge, and then if I switch back to the melee stance, it'll still be in battle memory and I can just use it again. So that's another good option that I wanted to point out. But this tip was a little bit shorter, so I'm kind of actually done with it and we can move on. Alright, as I have already hinted at, tip number 4 is on using Ranged Resounding Challenge, which is a surprisingly strong gambit that is often really overlooked. The often praised gambit lines are like the bleed one for damage over time, your light dot AoE line. If we go into melee stance, stuff like Desolation, your 2-3 line, I actually want to put this up here, and even Surety of Death, just that type of line is the one that's often considered for the amount of damage it deals in AoE. Another one I wanted to put up here was Unerring Strike, but Resounding Challenge, the non-range version, importantly, this one is weak and only has immediate upfront AoE damage. It does have some fringe uses if you want a ranged AoE that deals immediate damage. One important part of Ranged Resounding Challenge is it has no immediate damage, it's just damage over time, so it will do nothing to enemies for the first 4 seconds, which in some scenarios can actually be good, because then you aren't immediately pulling aggro with a lot of threat. It will take a little bit of time to build up, and that is a good thing, but it does mean it does less damage overall. If we compare it to something like Desolation with my numbers, I am in the blue line right now, but it's actually true even in the red line, and especially at higher levels. I'm on my 85 Warden, not my Louisden, my 130 Warden, to show those numbers. But the point is that Ranged Resounding Challenge is actually our strongest AoE damage over time, which is crazy because it is also ranged, has a huge radius, 10-meter radius. If I actually just use it again, I don't remember if I actually used it yet for this tip, but if I just use it, it hits all 4 of those training dummies, which are in a quite widespread out area, and I'm getting those huge 10.4k crits on them when it does crit. So it's a very strong skill, is basically the point of this tip. I just wanted to let everybody know about it because it's often overlooked and not even used. But I also did want to compare it. We already compared it a little bit to Desolation. It's a stronger AoE but no upfront damage, and of course Ranged Resounding Challenge is ranged. You do have to go in the ranged stance for it, Assailment stance. That's kind of the drawback is you have to switch to the range stance, but I do want to point out at very high level with a lot of trait points like my other Warden would have, you can get momentum in the yellow line even as a red line Warden, a melee DPS Warden. Momentum in the yellow line is you'll get an increased melee damage buff after entering the melee stance. So if you switch to range stance just to use range resounding challenge, you could switch to the melee stance and actually get increased damage. So you kind of get two benefits from going to range stance. First is that you can use range resounding challenge and get that awesome damage over time effect. But then when you switch to melee stance, you get a damage boost up to, I think, 20% melee damage buff after switching to that. And it's just pretty crazy and actually helpful that you have to switch to range stance for it, even though at low levels it might be a little bit annoying. And as we already covered quickly before I go over Unerring Strike, comparing it to that, here I'll just use it. But one thing we covered in the last tip a little bit was actually using it with battle memory. So you could put it in battle memory and switch to melee and go about all your melee stuff, and then you don't have to switch back to range stance for its next use. When the damage over time effect after like 30 seconds, you can use it again, and that is good. And now I can just use it again. There is kind of the point of that. But we can go ahead and we'll go ahead and stop auto attacking things, just turn around. I want to compare the actual damage it does to Unerring Strike, and on this character Unerring Strike is stronger. I think there are some points when you get your legendary items built up and some legacies on that range resounding challenge actually does more damage over time than even the bleed on Unerring Strike, but that'll be pretty high level until that happens, so it is kind of just something to consider. But anyway, kind of the point here is that range resounding challenge, even in single target, if you're like on a single target boss fight doing group content or something, it is very effective and something you do want to use in rotation. And the very last thing to cover as far as range resounding challenge goes is the yellow line. So the yellow line spec is not often played by people, especially while leveling, even though I find it plenty fun. It's actually pretty good now. It was more recently buffed and fairly strong, but range resounding challenge is insane in the yellow line. It's already strong in melee and even tank spec, but it is really crazy in the yellow line. The actual damage over time it does is a little bit less than you get in the red line and the blue line. If you don't have the light damage traits, you can actually, again with a lot of trait points, you can get some of the damage over time boosting stuff in the red line, like this light type damage. But right now on this Warden, I don't have that in for the majority of your time, or at least a long time on your Warden before you get a bunch of trait points. You'll mainly be focused in the yellow line. But anyway, the point is, with the stuff going on in the yellow line, you actually get a second damage over time component to it if you have the Barbed Javelin trait, wherever that is. There's Barbed Javelins, and that is going to be really strong. And just something I want to point out with the yellow line with range resounding challenge, and while leveling, this isn't really a good place to show this with a target dummy, so I'm just going to boot up a very easy to go in 3-man to show you all a situation where this could be a little bit useful at least. So while leveling, you can often pull enemies on a Warden and just chain pull enemies. So in the yellow line, you could actually go and get all the benefit out of using range resounding challenge. And this is something you might have seen a little bit in the background gameplay, like at the beginning and end of this, but it's just super quick once you get the actual damage over time components going with that. And you can even use your melee gambits, your 2-3-2 line, and that's pretty good with range resounding challenge. And I think actually once you can get the full Barbed Javelin trait, so after you finish the 4th row and get kind of towards being in the 5th row, Shattered Javelins is actually pretty strong, but around that point you could actually consider trying leveling in the yellow line. I think it'd be pretty fun and effective, especially if you like just chain pulling enemies, kiting them around and going about your business, but doing it all ranged. And even with the ranged spec and the ranged stance, you have other things like Javelin of Virtue here, which will be good for single target, and just things like that that I wanted to point out that go in combination with range resounding challenge very well. And I'm spending so long on this because it is something I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with, especially because the yellow line and even ranged gambits in general have traditionally been weak. But again, recent reworks with the yellow line, how Barbed Javelins and Shattered Javelin still works the same, but Barbed Javelins, you now have like guaranteed chance for bleeds on your ranged gambits. Anyway, we can go ahead and get off that because I think I finally covered everything with it. It's pretty crazy and a lot going on there. So moving on to tip number 5, it is about using your javelin skills, and really this tip is to serve as a reminder of the javelin skills and that they're useful. So it's probably confusing everything I have up on the screen. So the javelin skills you see from left to right on the middle is blue line, then red line in the middle, then yellow line on the right, and then the top 2 are just kind of universal between all 3 specs what they do. And marked and diminished target, I will say, are the same for red and blue line. They just gain a little bit of benefit in the yellow line, is why I have them separate there as well. But that's what's going on with what's on the screen. But for the actual tip, it is a reminder to use your javelin skills and what they do, because they're actually pretty impactful in addition to your gambits in that whole system. So first off, marked target and diminished target. These you really want to keep the debuff on enemies. In some short fights and while leveling, you won't really notice the difference of an enemy having reduced tactical mitigation, but at baseline these actually decrease the mitigation by 5%, I think. Even in my red line I have a trait to boost that slightly, is why the numbers are a little bit higher. But the point here is that these debuffs, that since they debuff the enemies, if I actually just use them, we can see that it gives the enemy a debuff of decreased mitigation. So that means anybody hitting the target, everybody in your group, fellowship, raid, if you're doing group content, they will be able to take advantage of the decreased mitigation. So it's a solid debuff to put on your enemies and very impactful. Again, in group content, you want to keep those up, and it's just really a reminder, because that is actually something I often forget about. I'm just so busy, I'm like, I want to use all my strong gambits, but these are very helpful to have up, and they'll even, as far as your performance, your damage you deal, help with that as well, because dealing increased damage from the decreased enemy mitigations is pretty significant. But moving on from that a little bit, another one I did want to point out was Warning Shot in the blue line. That one will decrease the outgoing damage of enemies, but the main draw of that is it's actually a force taunt. It's a short cooldown, 10-second cooldown, force taunt of an enemy, single target force taunt, and that was recently updated in update 27.2, where they changed a lot of taunts in the taunt mechanic a little bit. But with that, Warning Shot is going to be useful, so that was just a reminder for that as well. But the yellow line is where, of course, there's more emphasis on being ranged, so more emphasis on your actual javelin skills. So the ones I wanted to point out specifically with the yellow line is Javelin of Deadly Force. This one, it says for every target you hit, you gain a stack of ranged damage and critical damage buff. So we'll go ahead and look at that buff quickly, but to point out what Javelin of Force does is you just like toss your javelin out straight in front of you, and any enemies that are around that area will get hit. It's kind of inconsistent how it works, to be honest. If you're on a little bit of a hill pointing up or down, it won't work, so you gotta be pretty exact with it. Even there, it only hit 2 enemies. It somehow didn't hit the target training dummy on the left. But what that did was it gave me a 2% range damage and 8%, well, rather 4% range damage and 8% critical damage buff. But what it does is you get 2% range damage, I should actually put it over here, 2% range damage and 4% range critical damage for each enemy it hits. So it is worth using just to get that increased damage if you are playing the yellow line, especially in AoE situations. Otherwise, in the yellow line, marked target and diminished target, you can get traits to make those AoE, which is insane. Even getting that, if you're a high level red line warden with a whole bunch of trait points, you can get area targeting this trait in the 3rd row, and that will make them AoE. And also to point out the actual thing that affects those is, first off, you have something that can increase the duration lasting mark here. I do not have that on this character, but okay, sorry for the mix-up there, but what Enduring Assailment does is increase the debuff duration of gambits. Rather, Lasting Mark is the one that increases the duration of these debuffs, is the way that works. But yeah, the point is, with the yellow line, these are just better. We already covered what marked and diminished target do, and in the yellow line, they are AoE. It is a fairly small radius, so oops, accidentally used Javelin of Deadly Force. So that's actually not hitting them in AoE. The enemies do have to be tight together for that to work. But the last thing I wanted to point out with the yellow line was the snapshot. So when you use your gambit builders in the yellow line, you have a chance, and this is the last set bonus, by the way, that you can get this. Your gambit builders have a chance to unlock these snapshot gambits, and if I just keep using my gambit builders, eventually I'll get that. So you can just cast one of these gambits, one of these javelin skills as snapshots, even if the regular ones are on cooldown. And the 2 I wanted to highlight with that are Ambush and Javelin of Deadly Force. First off, using Snapshot Javelin of Deadly Force will give you the damage buff from that, so that's going to be useful for that. But also snapshot ambush, that actually gives Warden an in combat stun, so I can't show that on the training dummies unfortunately, but that's the way that works, is that you can use that in combat and get the in combat stun. But we haven't even covered what ambush does in general. So it's a short induction. You can actually use your skill, if we get out of combat I'll show this, you can use your skill careful step here, and that'll allow you to use ambush with no induction. It facilitates ability to ambush, and that's what it does. So I'll actually show that here, using careful step then ambush. And this is the Wardens if you need to open with a stun as a Warden. Of course the training dummy can't be stunned, but that's the way it works, and that's what ambush is good for. The last thing I want to point out in Wages of Fear, which is actually a pretty useless javelin skill unfortunately, it says it deals extra damage when used from behind. So this used to be a strong javelin skill, and maybe for anybody familiar with the old Warden, they might still think that, but it's not really that strong, and we'll go ahead and close it out. But that actually wraps up this tip. Again, it's really just a reminder of what these javelin skills do and remind you all to use them, especially marked and diminished target and group content. But otherwise this tip is done. So for tip number 6, we'll be shifting gears, and this one will be a little bit odd because it actually has to do with gear, and more specifically is that might is valuable. So might is of course actually less valuable than agility, but it does have some value to it and something we need to look at. So on the right here I have some gear pieces I will look over, but really to start off I want to compare might and agility. So might gives 2 physical mastery, it also does give 2 block rating and 3 block rating and 2 parry rating rather, but the main thing from that we're going to consider is the 2 physical mastery per point of might. Agility on the other hand gives 3 physical mastery, so it gives more physical mastery. That means we deal more damage with more agility, and it also gives critical rating as the main thing. The defensive stats on agility are actually equal to the ones on might, they're just parry and evade instead of parry and block. But again, the important thing is agility gives 3 physical mastery, whereas might only gives 2, and agility also gives 1 critical rating. So what I have here are some random gear pieces on the right, and kind of with this tip is that at lower levels especially, and really level 75 and below maybe, you will notice a lot of pieces of valuable gear that have might on them, or even might and agility, and it's just something to keep in mind while you're leveling and outfitting your Warden, gearing it while you level and just that sort of thing. Generally at very high levels a lot of gear is more oriented towards agility for Warden, but it is even something to consider. But again, the point is, if we look at some of these pieces that I just randomly pulled up from this barter, it's very helpful to actually show this. There's an earring right here that has some pretty good stats that has might on it but doesn't have agility, so it could be worth considering over something that's like lower level if you have something outdated and actually upgrading it with a piece of might on it that doesn't have agility. And that's kind of, these ones at the top here are kind of the situations I want to highlight with that. This is more of a defensive one, this necklace right here, and that has might, doesn't have agility, but it has some good defensive stats. It has morale, vitality, and even incoming healing as far as defenses go. But again, no agility, it has might, but the might will actually be a benefit on us for both of those because it does give physical mastery, so it's a little bit of a makeup for it not having agility. Again, here's a wrist item that has block and parry rating, so more of a defensive thing, even though those defensive stats aren't really the best, but it has a ton of vitality on it for that level, and it has might. It doesn't have agility, but again, if you don't have something better with agility on it, this could be worth considering. And just remember that might gives you some physical mastery out of that. Same thing with this pocket item on the right, a bunch of defensive stuff, and it does have might. That's kind of a lot of things with Moria and Mirkwood. You'll see a lot of pieces like this with might and defensive stats if you're building a tanking Warden for maybe group content at that level, or just want more survivability. You'll run into a lot of pieces with might, and again, the whole point here is that might gives you physical mastery. But some other examples are weapons at low levels. Now this specific weapon I found is actually a bad example because it's level 56, and by then you'll have your legendary weapon. But we'll just pretend this is lower level before you use your legendary weapon, and a lot of weapons you run into will have might and agility, and that's kind of, I just want to share that that's actually, you get the value out of might with physical mastery from that, but you also do get the value out of agility, so it's kind of a 2-for-1 with that. Pieces with both might and agility are extra strong for Warden because of that. And that is, yeah, the point of the sword Otherwise, there are some other pieces. I was just like quickly browsing the skirmish camp vendor to show you all some actual examples, but there are some other pieces of gear like this earring that has might, agility, and as far as stats we want, it has vitality and critical rating, which are good stats. This is a very good earring for level 50, and it has might and agility, so get the benefit again from might and agility, as I keep repeating throughout this tip. And if anybody is specifically interested in that specific earring, because it is good at level 50, if you go to the Eregion armor, the regular Eregion, this is at the classic vendor at the skirmish camp first of all, and if you go to the Eregion barter, that tab there, it says Minter's earring right here, and that's also where I got the beaded gemstone bracelet and the sword here just to show you all. But you know, the Minter's earring is a very good one at level 50, and that one just really highlights that might can be valuable when you find gear with both might and agility on it. But anyway, that is it for tip number 5, so we can move on. Tip number 6 rather. For tip number 7, I will be in-game here a little bit, but we'll actually shift to some background gameplay at the end of this one. And this tip is about practicing, because the Warden's very complex. You probably see me going about my Gambit builder super quick and just doing all this stuff and all this gameplay and going about all this really quick, even though it's like, which, as far as the Gambit mastery goes, which one builds what, and how do you know which to use, and all that sort of stuff, and how do you even remember the gambits you want to build to begin with. So there's a lot going on there, and a lot that makes it a bit hard seeming to get started with the Warden, at least. So my tip is to practice, and all that sort of stuff will come to you, and I think that's just the best way to learn Warden. So as we shift to background gameplay, I want to talk about this idea a little bit more. So again, one of the best ways I think to get familiar with the Warden is to actually just use it and consistently practice. And by practice, I mean play it, like play your Warden, level your Warden, do group content on your Warden or whatever. After a time, you should get more familiar with how the Warden works in all those systems. So it might take a while to be certain of how every gambit is built and what every gambit does and how effective each gambit is. But I think it's much more manageable to get really a baseline feel for how the Warden plays, even disregarding which gambit's useful, and you'll eventually learn how every gambit is built and what every gambit does by just practicing and playing the Warden. And approaching the class kind of step by step could be easier, I think, when you practice. So when I first started with the Warden, I thought I would never know all the gambits and how they work, but after more and more playtime, I just naturally learned them, and eventually I actually learned some interesting combinations with how they worked, and this was way back in the day before they made trait lines when I was doing this. But eventually I just never had to think about how to build a certain gambit anymore. It's just like came to me after a while. And it's a very fun class and rewarding once you do know that. I think it's even fun experience, and when I learned the gambits, that part was fun as well to me. But as a bonus tip here at the end, in addition to practicing, I think you should just have fun with the Warden. So for me, the most important thing to get out of a game or class is to have fun. So with the Warden, if you enjoy the class and gambit system, you first of all don't have to play optimally. If you do prefer some weaker gambits, or you still are learning class, that's okay. But as far as using like weaker gambits that I just mentioned, some of them have neat animations and effects and are just rarely used. Sometimes it can be fun to just use those, and that's okay if that's what you like. And that was kind of a bonus tip reminder here at the end. Alright, so that is it for my 7 tips, and again, I just want to remind everyone that feedback is appreciated because this type of guide is still new to me, but I do want to quickly recap what we covered. In the first tip, we talked about how Gambit Mastery Builders are very important to your Warden gameplay, and even though they can be hard to get started with and really know how to use them, they are going to be impactful and something you want to learn because they really ultimately help you build gambits faster, and of course gambits are our strongest skills with the Warden. For the second tip, we talked about using strongest gambits first, even though some gambit chains may make you want to go in order of number of gambit builders they use, because often those actually aren't worth using in the chain, and that's why you want to use the strongest gambits first. Anyway, for the third tip, we talked about how potency works and then some good gambits for battle memory, and specifically often gambits with the most builders, so like 4 or 5 builder gambits are often best to use with battle memory. For the fourth tip, we talked about how often overlooked and underutilized ranged resounding challenge gambit is, or that's also our 3-2-3-1, and that applies a very strong, large area of effect damage over time at a moderate range. For the 5th tip, we talked about our Javelin skills, and really it was a reminder to use them, and I pointed out which ones are most useful in which situations, but universally marked and diminished target provide valuable debuffs. For the 6th tip, we talked about the might stat, and that even though it is a secondary stat at best, there are situations where it could be useful because it provides a little bit of physical mastery. For the 7th tip, we talked about how consistently playing or practicing the Warden is how I think you can learn the class best, especially considering how complex it is to get started on and just all the intricacies on top of that. Alright, so that recap was essentially a too long to not watch summary of this video actually and what we covered, but I hope it was useful. But that is it for the 7 tips guide on the Warden class. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned more about the Warden, and I especially hope it helps improve your Warden experience. Again, that is the goal, and if it did do that, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or consider becoming a channel member to support the content where you can get early access to guides like this. But thanks for watching, everyone.